My name is Kamuela Enos. I'm going to go by Kamu. I'm from the community of Waianae, which is more west of here, so on the west coast of Oahu. My father and mother, Eric and Rochelle Enos. My father, I was blessed enough to be born into a family of activism, but a specific type of activism, I think, that started off in resistance to existing systems and moved more towards how are we being productive on our own terms within these systems, using our ancestral practices as a way to think about contemporary solutions. And I'm his oldest son, so I was kind of riding shotgun with my dad as he was trying to figure these very heady questions out while trying to run a nonprofit and be a father and a family. So I get to see it, from the very unromantic side of things, and this is more than just theory. So I've been blessed to actually have that life. And a lot of what I will talk about and maybe I know is really been gifted to me through that experience. It's not my dumb ass that came up with it. I try to be as the best steward as I can for those experiences. And I always love to, if people ask, because I felt they're meaningful to me, and if there's meaning for others in what what I was lucky enough to have been raised in, to me that justifies a lot of the hard parts of it too. Right now we're in Kapolei, which is, we talk about the future. This is going to be the second urban space on an already urbanized island. And
so like Honolulu being the first one.
And this is the second.
They envision growth like that here.
And I live, that's basically what it's zoned for.
Okay.
So it's on the doorstep of my community. And quickly about my community that I was raised in is a large concentration, probably one of the largest concentrations of Native Hawaiians in the world. But there's a historical context for that. Most of the Hawaiians who live in that community, not all of them, but a lot of them, like my family, were not genealogically from that community, but they were dispossessed from other lands and moved into what we call the homesteads, which also where Native Hawaiian settlements were resettled, which also happens to be the most dry, arid part of the state. So, why that story of Waianae matters and resistance that came out of my community matters relative to the future, relative to this space is, for a long time, the plus side of being relocated out to a space like Waianae is that we were rural, things are cheaper, and you could find intact traditional spaces like my father found at Ka'ala. But the buildup of an increasingly dense urban population on the doorstep will eventually create pressures of urbanization on my community where I'm from. And I'm also here because this is where my daughter dances hula with her kumu Mikiala Lidstone and Halau Ululuae kind of have claimed that mountain, which is Kapu, to Kapo, the Kapolei, and one of the female deities. So it's kind of in a nutshell who I am, where I'm from, why we're in this park, and maybe the things that I find fascinating as a Native Hawaiian who was lucky enough to be raised in a traditional context, in a tradition of activism and practice, but also being told that I couldn't just hide in it. My dad made me go to college. I can't just hide on a farm because the forces of places like this will wipe out places like that. and we have to be able to develop dual fluencies. We have to understand the language of urbanization objectively. There's a lot of gifts that come from urbanization too, like that we have to acknowledge, you know, and then have that objective understanding of our ancestry too. Not to romanticize them, which is I believe, which is the opposite side of the same coin of like demonizing them.
Right. Yeah.
We try to understand them as people whose culture that they created and traditions, before anything else, was shaped by environmental and social realities. That's what made them what they are, right? So featuring for me is something that I'm really passionate about. And there's these conversations. Part of it is, maybe I can put a period on it and you can ask the next question. I'll just keep running away.
No, I'm happy to have you keep going.
It's just the sun has moved.
No, I want you to keep talking. I want you to talk about sort of the featuring, like.
Sure.
Like I think it's great, this location, and sort of
Right.
talking about like what this, because when we came off the freeway,
Right.
we like sort of looked down the hill. We were like, what is that? Like.
Yeah, you'd expect to have a conversation with a Hawaiian activist in a farm, right? And I think you might as well own it.
Yeah.
You know, it's the farms and the areas of productivity is where we aspire to be. But we also have to be in these spaces too. And I think that's why I'm really passionate about the idea of futuring, but understanding the future. Also important is if you look up that mountain there is an important it's called Maka Kilo, and kilo it was literally used because when you climb up, to my understanding as the elders who've told me about its role in traditional society, you have a good vantage point of everywhere coming from Kauai and all the way down the coast. So strategically, you're able to vision. And Maka Kilo, to kilo is also to vision. So there's a space of visioning. And I also felt symbolically like,
Good place to be under.
and I think that's an important understanding for us as Native people, as we become more self-aware of who we are, and the initial desire is to move away from what we call colonization, or like the indoctrination, or what's that term they use to pull people into a culture? Assimilation.
Yeah.
Which is always a good starting point. And it's a good realization, but I also think there's a Zen saying I've always liked, that if you add a cup of ink, a drop of ink into a cup of water, you can never take it out, right? And I think that's the reality of assimilation, is like, we're also of this space. Is, we can talk about culture all we want, but it's something I bring up is like, I have an iPhone. And this iPhone is basically crafted with children's hands from China and rare metals mined out of a mountain. And I use it quite frequently to do indigenous things.
Right.
So internally in the first world, this conversation about who we are is important. But to the rest of the world, we're complicit as much as anybody else, right? And to me, that's the realization I've had, and I want to own. So therefore, featuring too is very comprehensive. I really believe, just through the activism that my father was raised me in, and being raised in a really poor community, and dropping out of high school, like my story is, even though I was raised by a taro farmer and like who was a college educated, went back home and was active in a community. Me and all my brothers dropped out of our high school. And I think there's so many ways that featuring to me comes into play. I never really felt at home in my schools. We had this really weird childhood of like a father teaching us cultural practices, making us work in the mountains. A mother who was also Native Hawaiian, but making us read all the time because she wasn't from this community and she moved from an affluent, she was Hawaiian, but she's from an affluent side of the island. She moved to Hawaiian and she was like, holy shit, these kids are gonna be raised here. The schools are like horrible. Read Albert Camus, read all these different things. So like I'd go from working in Lo'ikalo to reading The Stranger in 6th grade to then having it be authentically a part of my peer group.
Right.
Going to our public schools where the last thing you want anyone ever to figure out is that you're smart.
So you're
Hell
reading
no,
that
like
stuff.
hell no. So you play in it, right? And there's like a blessed schizophrenia that comes to bear. That if we survive it without submitting to drugs or violence, because we just can't reconcile it, I think if we can get past that, I think it provides us a unique vantage point. And I make that at the micro and also at the macro. And if we can survive this at the macro level and come out recognizing we're heirs to multiple traditions, and we can become fluent in their system, but we have the competitive advantage of fluency in our own ancestry. And if we can then talk about our ancestry not purely from terms of identity, but also from practical considerations, then, we're setting ourselves up to answer questions that I think the dominant paradigm has forgot to ask anymore. Like, what is our value to our lands? What is our relationship to our landscape? What is our relationship to each other that is not mediated purely by capital? But we understand capital, so we can be awesome in capital, so we're not yelling from the outside. We can be talking to them in their language.
Well, I like the corollary of the inheritors of multiple traditions. It's also inheritors of multiple futures.
Right. And that's what I was thinking about too, because part of like the trajectory is like, I was forced to read all these books, but I fell in love with science fiction. And that was like me, if you meet my brother Solomon. The community comes from Hawaiian and we consider ourselves like closet nerds. I was super closeted about my nerddom.
You what?
Super closeted about my nerddom.
Okay, right.
He was pretty open, he was out. Oh boy had like green dyed hair and combat boots and nose ring in Waina High School. Shit, he was out and proud. I kept it on the DL. I was like, but I think initially it was a point of escape, but because of the family I had and the call to critical thinking, then it became just this space. I realized it quickly it was a way to forecast out ideas in the future. And when we had that talk you guys were a part of several years ago, part of what I wanted to introduce as a thesis, like it's not like how do we have indigenous science fiction, but the deeper question was like, what was science fiction to our ancestors? Because I don't want to just paint brown people in spaceships.
Right. Well, you have a nice quote. I don't remember what it's from. I don't think it's the TEDx talk. I think it's a different talk where you talk about, how we're the science fiction of our ancestors.
Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
So their science fiction was to prophesize.
Right.
So there's places where they prophesized on the mountain, they visioned. Yeah. Those were the Herberts in the Highlands. And I've been reading a lot of Dahlgren.
Oh yeah? Samuel L.
The Delaney's.
Yeah.
They were their prophets.
Yeah.
And they're forecasting things. So that's what science fiction, that's what it got me early. And I think it was through reading those stories that I began to reconcile these three, up until that point, extremely dissimilar realities of Western intellectualism, deep cultural practice, and
science fiction provided space to kind of bring those
together. And the realities of growing up in poverty with your peers.
Right. With Noe, we had we had the tourist helicopters about every 10 minutes.
Hopefully this isn't too rambly.
No, it's perfect. It's beautiful.
I really love that idea of sort of like science fiction of being a space where you can reconcile
Right.
these different things.
It was science fiction and punk rock for me, and heavy metal. I was a closeted metalhead, and I was a closeted. So like reading Tolkien and listening to Iron Maiden and Dio for me was.
Good combination. What did your mom think about the science fiction, right? So your mom's trying to get you to read Camus.
She started off by having us eventually. We had Tolkien lying around the house.
Okay.
And my grandfather, my father's father, who was a blue-collar Native Hawaiian machinist in Pearl Harbor. Him and my grandmother was also Native Hawaiian, blue-collar. She was a maid, Joel and Kamuela Enos. She was a maid in Waikiki. They had the foresight to buy land. So they bought land out in Makaha. So we were raised with land, and these were hardcore workers. And I don't know what level of education they had, but my grandfather, so my mother made me read maternally, but my grandfather paternally was a reader. And he was self-taught, and I always remember him as a kid reading after all day working in the field, and he'd have his cup of coffee and his filtered cigarette. And I just remember him reading Dune.
Read Dune?
Yeah, I remember he was reading Dune Messiah, and I just fell in love with the book cover.
Uh-huh.
And my grandpa was a super badass. He was hard to pigeonhole because he was real Hawaiian, but he was just later in statistics I learned about curves and outliers.
Right.
And how you can't make a general claim anymore.
Right.
So I think, now I'm just talking about it now, it's bringing that memory back up, right? So what I learned the intellectualism of my mom and the activism of my father were both kind of retreats. But what I learned from growing up with my peers, who are all from Waianae, who are all different levels of violence in the household, is that I can't run away from that. I can't be above them. I love them, right? So I can't talk down to them. So it's the calling was, how do I make this make sense to them? I can shut up about it. And I found that once I started doing that, then I felt real happiness. It was bringing these ideas to my friends and making it a challenge for me to talk to my boy that could give a shit about everything but girls and sounds and drinking externally, but I know his internal, who he is as a person, and talk to him about these things and have these conversations. That just helped me. Science fiction A was a gateway for me to think about the world, and then B, to reconcile things, but then want to share it with people, and then talk to them about ideas. Yeah.
And how did you meet the challenge? How did you get them to talk about those things?
I always understand people from the bottom of the pyramid, their Laszlo needs. And if I was just to talk about, so I wouldn't even talk about science fiction per se,
Right.
but I would talk about the themes I loved in science fiction. I used to have this thing that, or fantasy. Aragorn was Hawaiian. It's why? It's okay, listen. Listen.
Got it figured out.
Why I believe he was Hawaiian was, at least, and this is when I was 19, I was talking to my friend, we were in Hawaiian studies class together, and he's the heir of a kingdom that he's no longer king. And how does he make it manifest? Him and his friends, they live on the bounds in the wilds around their former subjects and protect them for no fanfare. That's just their thing.
Yeah.
So it's never about the privilege, it's always about the responsibility over the people, which was made clear to us, our chiefs weren't privileged. They were the people that cared for us. And they hell or high water, that's what the prerogative was. And okay, and it's like, and right when he went into the wilds and and Frodo got stabbed by the Nazgul, he knew the La'au, he knew the medicines, right? And he looked at it, he was a healer, and I was like, and then when they were scared, right, and they were like frightened, like he would chant the stories of his ancestors to them, and like okay, and like you can see that kind of awakening. And for me, I was just testing theses out to see if it fit, right? And if it made sense to my friend, I could give a shit about if it made sense to my professor. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not there to impress my teachers or anything. I'm there for the people I care about. And I always felt like my role was to take these heady things and see if it made sense. Because it was making sense to me and it was helping me reconcile stuff. So it may be a bit obtuse, but you know, you can't talk about the future without understanding the ramifications and who is that future for. And there's that great quote I saw someplace, all science fiction is political, because it presupposes a set of circumstances and extrapolates them out. You can't fucking have objective science fiction, right? It's totally subjective of who's the person and who gets to make that world, right? And whether the inherent biases or political.
Well, what those people are going to want.
Right.
In that time,
So yeah, sorry, that was off on a super big tangent.
No, that totally was not. You know, I mean, I think it's a fantastic way of thinking about how science fiction and fantasy can be used to understand your present situation. Right. You know, even if you're you're a native kid here in Waianae, right? You're reading something written by an Oxford Don.
I was listening to like Throbbing Gristle reading William Burroughs by the time I was 17 and trying to reconcile that.
Bring that in too.
It's like, you know, those are all I think people, in terms of me thinking about it, I mean, those people are all the outliers that eventually created the new curve, right?
Well, and it's really interesting now, right, to see how central science fiction has become in popular culture.
Right.
Because when we were reading them, they were like,
it was a musty book in a library that no one else.
You had to go and hunt down and find and
Right.
You know, I don't know about you, but our teachers were like, they weren't, they didn't say we shouldn't, but they were just like, man, you know.
Our teachers are like, okay, you're reading. Thank God.
Go.
I don't care if it's Penthouse Forum, just read. God, do something. Just don't be on the street drinking with your friend, right? I'm being a bit profane here, but it was like that level of like, read, kids, read.
And so for can you just talk quickly, just so we have context in the video about the work that you do at the farm?
So, like my dad, I wear a lot of hats, and maybe I can talk a bit, because each of them I think is important, but the hat that feeds my family is, I work at a social enterprise called Maori Organic Farms now. I've been here for 10 years, and this is in a nutshell, Ma'o is a not-for-profit that generates revenue. The revenue generating part of our program is a 24-acre fully certified organic farm, and it's located in the coast of Waianae, where I was raised. The founders of our program, our husband and wife team, Gary and Kukui, Mauna Kea Fourth, and they're both from the community. And I think I can't really talk about them without quickly talking about the context in which Ma'o was created. So the community of Waianae is kind of like the Oakland of Hawaii. Like the Oakland of Hawaii. So you had a lot of like concentrated poverty, and therefore, but a lot of really, it's one of the communities that are like the Oakland of Hawaii, but like a lot of activism came out of Waianae. Like Waianae and Molokai, I think are just, can't throw a rock without hitting an activist. I think it's kind of like, but Waianae was early goers, like my dad's organization of folks. They started radicalized in the 60s by, just this, what was going on the continent around racial equality and identity. And then came back and started to bring that thinking to community. So my dad and a bunch of his peers, men and women, Native Hawaiian and non-Native Hawaiian, really started a movement where they occupied land in the back of a valley and brought back water to restore traditional lo'ikalo. And back in the 70s, when it was like, that was not cool, especially for the Hawaiians. A lot of Hawaiians who are just who've been told to assimilate. And I'm not going to cast stones at them because the pressure was real. Like, why are you doing that? You're opening up wounds for us. We're trying to like assimilate to this world and be good Americans. Like, we've lost everything. Why are you doing this to us? Why are you bringing these things back, right? So it was like one of those blessed unrest moments. And my dad, them stuck to their guns and they brought their water down and they kind of normalized what is now called Aina-based education. Like creating contemporary classrooms using traditional practice. And for a long time, they were really hardcore about doing that. But what ended up happening is they began to fight for land. The more successful they became in using traditional practices, the more pressure they put on contemporary society and the need to develop. And quite often they'd want to stop development in the community so they could do traditional practices. What the developer would have to do is say, well, we're going to provide this, with this golf course you want to build, it's going to provide jobs. And then boom, and you rip your community in half. And both sides had real issues. And they wanted to see, okay, now, well, how do we now create jobs then? How do we use our traditional practices to create jobs? And out of that came this conversation that then was called community-based economic development. So how do we create jobs using traditional practices? How do we use ancestral thinking to provide meaningful employment that we own, that match the character of our community, that match the carrying capacity of our geography? And as it iterates off of the brilliance of our ancestry, which are lofty aspirations, and I think for the most part, they were incredibly committed and visionary, but lacked the business smarts. So they struggled. So Ma'o is like the second wave of that because the founders of Ma'o had the dual fluencies of understanding traditional practices, but also being college educated and knowing how to write good grants, how to create business plans, right? So Ma'o is the iteration off of that. And in its current iteration now, so Ma'o is a social enterprise. We're now the largest organic farm on Oahu. So we do about 700,000 a year, 2 tons of food a week. And the fact that we're located in Waianae in of itself is a social, is an act of positive deviance, I guess you will. But what truly makes us a social enterprise and why we're not for profit is the daily operations of the farm is now run by young adults from our community through a college internship. So we have interns work on our farm. We have rigorous vetting process that today was the last day of over the summer to enter as a cohort. And once they get in, they sign a contract to work with us for 2.5 years in exchange for their sweat equity on the farm Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 20 hours a week, 7 to 12. We provide them a full tuition waiver to college and $500 a month. And when we are able to access the revenue, we also open a bank account that we do a 3-to-1 match for them. We teach financial literacy, college preparedness, and work ethic. And we ask for a 2.5-year commitment because we graduate them with their associates, and then create a program for them to move on to be managers of the farm, wherein they're salaried with full benefits, and then we help them pay for their baccalaureate degree. And we've leveraged that model to actually, it's a 12th cohort. So we have a whole bunch of interns that have gotten their degrees and now running the daily operations of the farm. And we have one intern in particular, well no, she's no longer an intern, her name is Koe Sana. And she started with us when she was in high school. And was the first intern to get her associates, and then she got her baccalaureates. And upon getting her baccalaureates, we made her farm manager.
Yeah.
So one of the greatest like joys in my life, aside from my children and my job, is a 28-year-old Native Hawaiian woman is my boss. And legit,
That's pretty fabulous.
you know, and then she came through the programs, right? And that's kind of what I do on a daily basis. I'm the director of social enterprise, so there's 2 metrics we track on a daily basis on our farm. It's the sales of our product and the GPAs of our students. And those 2 metrics in contemporary society are metrics of power. So we're job creators and degree designers. But more importantly to me, in the ancestral practices that we had and the way our ancestors had set up a society, it was, as I understand it, completely self-sufficient in their own watershed. And it was also a society that was, wealth was non-monetary. The 2 things we tracked then, ancestrally, during our ceremonies, our yearly ceremonies, was fitness of land, fitness of people and abundance of land. So we did this makahiki ceremony where they would come and do fitness games. The chiefs every year would come in and there'd be this ceremony where the people would bring abundance of food, and then before the chiefs they'd do like feats of martial strength or core strength. And everybody has misconstrued that in contemporary Dewey as like, oh, this quaint, it's this festival. But you know, and there's going to college and taking econ and everything in my master's, and like that was actually a year-end reporting to your chief. Because if you read Lili Kala Kamuela Enos, Native Land and Foreign Desires, which is a great book, she talks about the pre-contact economy, and she makes differentiation between feudalism and traditional practice. In feudalism, to in a nutshell, super generally, the land and the people were the means to capital, that the vassals paid upstream to the church and to the royalty. They were the means to capital, right? In traditional pre-contact times, the land and the people were capital, because there's no intermediary of cash. So they treated people very different. It was a very different distinction. So we've taken those 2 principles of land and people as capital, as our, you know, as what we invest in, and we created a contemporary corollary of the sales and GPAs. And we also do it as a nonprofit, so that all the money goes to the mission versus to any individual. And I can show you my car, you know. So that's my day job, and I think the commonality I have with all the other hats I wear is this idea that I call, well, it's a term I've heard used, but I've actually populated it with I've populated it with my specific thoughts around it, is indigenizing. And for me, indigenizing literally, as I understand, is repurposing contemporary structures to be vehicles for ancestral responsibilities. So we've used this kind of framework to repurpose organic farming to be a vehicle for, so we do organic farming, therefore, not because we are enamored with organic farming per se, but it's the closest correlative to how our ancestors grew food in a contemporary structure. Because our ancestors, like organic farmers, put the emphasis on the regenerative health of the soil, where contemporary farmers and conventional farmers put the emphasis on annual crop yields at the expense of labor and at the expense of environmental concerns.
Right.
If you did that in pre-contact times, you would have been. There wasn't a lot of corporal punishment. There was a lot of capital punishment, and capital punishment as political theater.
Right.
Like, you watch one capital punishment and you'd be like, yeah, let's not
do that.
No. And I'm not. Again, I'm humanizing that. I'm not.
Well, that's what I was gonna ask. I mean, or sort of comment is that, you know, earlier on, and actually I'm not sure whether we got it on tape or it was before the tape started rolling. You know, you were talking about romanticization being the flip side of the dehumanization coin.
Right.
And so I wanted to dig into that a little bit in the context now, in talking about recovering traditional ways of living with the land. But along with those traditional ways come a whole structure of living And sort of how do you tease those things apart as you figure out where you want to go?
Right. To me, how I look at it is like culture. To me, was to a great extent defined by your geography. And if your geography teach people, then your landscape is your ultimate kumu. Your landscape is always going to be your teacher. And if you love your culture over understanding your relationship with your landscape, you're using your culture as lip service for bad behavior. You know, and you can be practicing all the culture you want on paper, the culture you learned in college. But if your landscape isn't productive, you know, then you just. I had a great kumu talk to me, and she's talked about hula. And I'm paraphrasing Auntie Pua Kanako Ole in a talk I saw her give. And so much about hula practice is that you go up to the mountain and you bring down what you need to adorn yourself for the hula. And as someone said, oh, isn't it easier just to bring and grow those stuff in your backyard? And like the paradigm flipping response she gave is like, no. The point of hula is that you're taking care of the mountain. And like ritual has sometimes and I say this lovingly because of the historical context, sometimes when we've been divorced and severed from our traditional entirety of like our society, which includes economics and pedagogies, we try to relearn our culture, but sometimes all that's there is the surface, and we fall in love with the surface again. But she's like she has such an unbroken lineage that she pointed to the deeper part of what's the intention of the ritual. It's like this, like if you want to be a hula practitioner, you have to understand your job is to care for the landscapes, and you have to understand. Like someone said, like the mountains hold the original lei that you're then weaving. It comes from what's laid, that original lei that the mountain is wearing that you're pulling and then replicating, right? And I think we need those people who are holders of a tradition, but in a purest form, but understand the purity, understand the relevance of that tradition to 21st century problems. And then you also need the people who are going to be on the other side of it, who feel empowered to who have the same respect for the tradition and figure out how do we iterate it into a contemporary space, right? And that's the futuring of it.
One of the things, Noe Arista talks about when she talks about her archival work and the methodology around that is the idea, like the old archivist is, somebody that contained all the lore.
Right.
And so when new situations came up,
right,
you went and talked to him to sort of figure out how do we deal with this new situation?
Right.
And he sort of kind of did the search and sort of came up with the things in the past that motivated how to deal with it now.
Right.
And it's really powerful, not just metaphor, but actually you can imagine that instantiation, and the necessity for that.
Right. I mean, I guess that's the challenge of indigenous indigenous people in the 21st century. It's ultimately the cultures that were bequeathed existed because they were practical. There is a utility to them. And I think we find ourselves in this weird conundrum where the baseline of our pyramid is met by Costco and Apple, and we're choosing to practice our culture. That's me, right? I'm not pointing a finger at anybody but myself, the realities of it. But I think being self-aware of it is really important. And then trying to figure out then, for me, the wrestling match I always have, and it's kind of expressed in other nonprofits that I'm a part of, like Purple Hawaii People's Fund. I'm on the board of my father's organization at Ka'ala. Is kind of like futuring. It's forecasting what are the dynamics that are going to be happening to our world that are in play now. Climate change, increasing move towards the siloing of society, culturally, health disparities, wealth disparities, all these different things. And like you said, looking at our ancestral practices as a codex and as a well to mine contemporary solutions from. And doing that not just because I want to romanticize my ancestors, but for me, the part I look at is like, objectively, our ancestors were able to live in closed-loop societies on the most finite biosystem on the face of the earth. And they were bequeathing abundance upon the pain of death. If you didn't, either nature will kill you or the chiefs will kill you if you're getting in the way of doing that. And that to me was taught to them by the kumu, by the teachers that is our island. Our island taught that. And they taught hard lessons. And they taught the people, my ancestors, how to live within their context. And the brilliance of our ancestors is what they did with the teaching. But they were not, like the ultimate respect always goes to the land, because the land is your teacher. And then it goes to your ancestors that survived. Because and there you're talking about a certain population, and those that didn't, they don't get their story told. And having, that then, when we look at how we look at our ancestral practice as a codex to pull from, acknowledging it in that place, from that perspective, versus everything my ancestors do are awesome. And you can't talk about them bad in any type of way. I mean, that's like, that's
faulty knowledge then, right? Like if you're not talking about the things that were either bad or things that we look back on now and sort of like not really sure about that, you don't understand the whole system, right? You don't understand the trade-offs that people are making. And
I mean, that to me is an important part of where I think the movement needs to go. People talk a lot about political sovereignty, which I get. And I used to believe, like, before you could have political sovereignty, we need to have food sovereignty. And now being in the food sovereignty movement, but understanding that food is a process of having a group of people work together consistently over time and be at the table and find ways to be resilient. I've added another layer. Like, before we can have food sovereignty, each and every one of us has to have emotional sovereignty. We have to have sovereignty over our emotions. We need to be critical thinkers. We need to be resilient. But we also need to be compassionate. And if you look in the Hawaiian language, there's so much of that embedded in our practice. People talk a lot about Hawaiians as warriors, but our traditions of reconciliation are about as complex and robust as our traditions of warfare. And to me, like, that's the codex I want to pull from when we think about program design for 21st century social enterprise that's receiving millions of dollars from the Kellogg Foundation, that's being visited by Michelle Obama, but it's these accolades that's being thrown at us, is like, be really clear that we're iterating from things our ancestors already knew. So when we say our ancestors are powerful, we're not making a blanket statement that can't be critiqued. We're putting our footnote and doing our homework and saying this is the reason why, right? And I think that to me is a big part of when we talk about futuring. I kind of created this paradigm to help with program design that I call the triple Picot analysis. I don't know if I shared that with you. I got tired of hearing a triple bottom line, so I wanted to create. I got tired of these Silicon Valley types telling me what's innovation. I was like, fuck you guys. Long story. I love them, but it's just more like, No,
I worked in the Valley for 15 years. I have the same, I think.
I've had a chance to visit, and I really think I say that as a joke, but I think there's so much if there's one part of America that I'm attracted to, Silicon Valley, because I think there's a lot of opportunities for ideation. And I just want to make sure that we come to the table, not hat in hand.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
We know our relative worth.
Yeah.
Right? And that's kind of what I want to be, us as a people first, to be clear of and not convincing them. So the triple Picot analysis for me is like, I use it when it's my version of science fiction, if you will. And one of our great kumu, Dr. Kekuni Blaisdell, was such a forward thinker, and he did so much for our people as a Hawaiian physician, but also a thought leader. And I learned this from people who learned it from him. But traditionally we have 3 Picot, right? And Picot are connection points. You have your fontanelle, you have your navel, and your reproductive organs. And Picot is like, that's what Picots were kind of mentioned. And Picot O is your top, is your fontanelle, was supposed to be a connection to your ancestors and all those that came before you. Picot E, which is your navel, was a connection to those that are alive now, in the time we call the Ao. And Picot A is your reproductive organs, and that's your connection to your future. So we talk about the navigators who have to hold the 3 transects of where you came from, what's the island you're going to, and where you are now. That's that transect, right? And it's not you, you are a chain. You know, so when I talk about triple Picot analysis and the idea of indigenization, of repurposing existing structures, the first part I always start with is like, you know, what is your traditional practice that you're bringing into a contemporary space? Be super specific, granular. What was it done? How was it done? Where was it done? How was success measured? Like all of these different things. How did they judge it? Like who could do it? Like be really clear on it. Just say I'm doing traditional tarot farm. Like it's because if you're not clear, it's like saying I practice martial arts.
Right.
I practice religion. It's like, dude, like you need a little bit more to work with, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first Picot, like understanding what are you trying to bring from the past, and try to be as clear and understand as deeply as possible. Especially how they measured success. How did you know they were doing it right? Then the second Picot is like, then how is that traditional practice being deployed in a contemporary space to bring executive power to your community? Not advisory, choice and control. And understand like what does that look like and how is that sustained? What iteration does it look like? What corridor does contemporary society provide you to move into, to practice that? But what value system are you held accountable to make sure that you're not being co-opted? It's like, you can say you want Hawaiian economic development, and I can point to a brother of mine that was selling crystal methamphetamine as a native Hawaiian. It's like, that's the Hawaiian business person. This is dangerous as saying you practice the culture. It's like, you're business people.
Right.
And what I've learned from operating in this space, what it means to be a traditional entrepreneur is to refuse to externalize the cost of production on people and landscape. And then point to the stories of the chiefs that were purely about the material gain, a lot of them, and how they got killed, right? And there's a lot of them. So that you don't want to be that chief. So the second Picot is like, how are you using a traditional practice and the values of that practice, not just the external trappings, to be a successful contemporary space and be specific. And then the third Picot for me is like, then how is that traditional practice being deployed in a contemporary space, providing a platform for future generations' right to abundance and right to agency? So if I unpack that, then at Ma'o Farms, using traditional farming in a way that's using land, being a profitable business while sending kids to college, to have choice and control over our land, because the West only understands land's relative value and highest and best use in how much, either in conservation or its highest commercial, right? To show it that way.
Can we just
Sure.
because the sun is
So that's it's providing agency for our students and like holding on to our land. And then to be the futuring of it is then what's the ramifications of having more and more young adults going to college. And we've created a college degree program at West Oahu. It's Bachelor's of Applied Science in Sustainable Community Food Systems, that we've headhunted a world-class professor in agroecology, Professor Albie Miles, down to teach. And
he's already here?
He's here. He's been teaching. We graduated our first intern with their baccalaureate this semester.
Nice.
This one we presented at Harvard and we presented at this nexus between Stanford, Berkeley, and we have. It's really moving in. That's the future. Like the third Picot is how we're providing a platform. Is like we've built a structural institution that will outlive us. And though it exists at the university, the metrics of efficacy that he puts out there to track is climate change, health disparities, and wealth disparities. And making a case in this intersect between academics and this practice of workforce and academia is doing the science behind restoring traditional practices. If those are the three things that are facing our generation now, restoring traditional land use practices begin to reverse climate change, because traditional practices is a carbon sink, and and limiting. Well, the industrialization of food is driving most of our greenhouse gases, is driving most of our health disparities, and people being dispossessed for their land in Hawaii is what is driving poverty. Right. And restoring that and teaching our students to learn not just the farming part of it, but the political, the scientific, all of these different pieces around them, will have them be people that have agency in restabilizing the climate. And if you're growing food locally, you're distributing locally, then you have an opportunity to shift health. Right. And if you're doing that as a business and you're putting it out there to set up as an economic driver again for your state, you are actually generating revenue. And our goal is not to create new jobs, our goal is to create new sectors that can support secondary and tertiary economies by the restoration of food systems. Right. And to me, that's the triple Picot as an example of how we look at it, right? So I say that as my brother Solomon has been super creative. He had a chance to and I found I have to move that creative part of me into the grant writing and the program design. So I see I see my work then and thinking through that is similar to what William Gibson was doing when he's writing Neuromancer. He's forecasting stuff out, or even Herbert was forecasting Dune. I look at how they did stuff and I try to approach the program design, but I think I've been blessed in one way because I can put it into practice. Right. And then.
Can you talk a little bit about Purple Maya? I mean, I think
sure.
Part of what you were talking about is Purple Maya work.
And that's a really great segue, because once we opened that, we had an interesting opportunity in our program to merge with a digital media program in our high school, because they wanted to also create college internships. It was called Sea Rider Productions. And we had a Kellogg grant that linked us together, and my executive director, Kukui, threw me in to do some sense making behind it. I was like,
Your executive director what?
Threw me in to help with some of the sense making behind it.
Yeah.
Because it was a good idea, but it just needed a thesis, right?
Yeah.
So I sat down and I looked at the digital media guys, looked at the farming. They have a wonderful program. It's high school within high school that's getting kids from Waianae to graduate from college. I mean, they're kicking ass nationally. They're always back then, they're winning every single national award competition. And we had in the same community, and it was community driven. So we had Ma'o Farms, we had Sea Rider Productions that were created by community members in a community that was ostensibly low income. And we were successful in really powerful ways. And I began to look at what made him successful. And I started to realize I deployed that triple Picot framework. I was like, these kids ain't just doing good because we give them video cameras. They're doing good because their ancestors were storytellers. And the founder of Sea Rider, who was from Waianae herself as a teacher, had this epiphany that back in the 90s, she was going to lose students that just didn't want to sit in her class in Spanish. and they're acting out. It's like, I have them film their homework. And by just giving them a camera, they started filming the homework. She kept a bunch of students that would have failed. And she just took the dynamic back as it, like, if I get 2 cameras, I'll keep more students. She built this kind of big system out of that simple principle. So looking at Triple Picot is like, what resonates is the kids in our community want to be outdoors, they want to work with their hands, they want to tell stories, not because they're stupid or special ed, because that's how the ancestors lived. And this is still the last bastion of localism where that still is there. So that's the first Picot. Like, it was strong because our ancestors were storytellers in organic farming. Then the next point, Picot was like, these also represent upside markets that have a lot of upside. So the digital media piece, like, in thinking about a future for Hawaii, what I also loved about watching them work at Sea Rider is that they didn't have the same type of limitations to the market that we did. Because we're tied to exports, imports, costs. They could participate in a cloud economy. I was like, man, and the footprint of their little studio was making as much as our farm. So start thinking about, like, what does a future Hawaii that's weaned itself off of militarism and tourism, what are we going to need? Because we can't just diagnose the problem. You got to add a cure, right?
Yeah.
You can just go to the doctor and say, I have cancer. Does it help you solve it? It's like, I think we're stuck in the diagnosis phase and think that we're winning. But like, you got to have something to do when you have the diagnosis. Yes, we've been colonized, and yes, structural racism exists. We got to actually build a counterpoint, right? So in that society, like, I just think you'd have large swaths of land that was growing food, and that you'd have these little pockets that we could be global thought leaders and participate in a cloud economy. And like, I never played checkers. The Hawaiian correlative of chess is konane. I'm not trying to think one move. I like just playing this for a couple of generations down the line to set up the infrastructure, right? So I saw there's an investment in that. So I started that with Sea Rider, and I just became enamored with this idea of, I called it Aina-based industries and Ike-based, our knowledge industries and our land industries as being the core pillars of how we restore our agency as people again, with or without paper sovereignty. Like, you know,
how do you enact it?
Enact it, you know, and help the people that was doing the sovereignty work too, by giving them an engine to build off of. And then, so it's a long answer, but like, I became fascinated with that. And like Jeff and my brother Solomon started also concurrently being interested with that and talking about ideas. And at that time, Donovan Kealoha reached out to me and asked if I'd be on the board because I had some of that work already and done with Sea Rider. So I went in and I just got a chance to watch them work. And I realized then, to me, like, the triple Picot for that is like, by teaching Indigenous, it's not teaching brown kids how to code, right? That's part of it.
That's part of it, but yeah, it's not.
But if that's the be-all, end-all, it's patronizing.
Well, yeah, and I mean, like, for us, like, the video game workshops we do, it's not about
right.
teaching them how to make
It's a pathway, exactly. And I think that's why I really appreciate your approach and listening to you talk. I mean, it's much deeper than that. So the triple Picot deployed to what I saw in Purple Maya is, first, if you talk about Indigenous coding, you have a vehicle to talk to them about Indigenous technologies. And like, your ancestors had technologies. And I talked to you about before, but like, you know, you can talk about these things like the closed loop biosystems of how you managed your land, this idea of the chants and those long chants that we had as like all of these data sets that we transferred mnemonically perfectly, that was part of our purview, like the algorithms of our moon calendars and when we would and wouldn't do things, the binary offer, like those are things that you will see too in contemporary tech spaces. The difference is that I feel the danger of the contemporary tech sector is tech for tech's sake.
Yeah.
Versus you could say very clearly, this technology of ancestry serves something very specific. And there's a group of people allowed to live in their place. So there's a deep, other than the return on the investment, there's other measures that you could look at. So it starts off with, this is Indigenous technology and this is what it's used for. Then the second Picot I found in like the work they're doing in Nanakuli High School with Jeff guys, and the work Donovan was doing at inner city schools. If you teach kids who are living in poverty to code and hack, you're also teaching them to hack into the operating systems of poverty. This isn't
Impoverishing them. Yeah.
this isn't set forever.
Yeah.
You can fuck with this. You can find ways to move this around. You are not just acted upon. You can be an actor.
Yeah.
Like that Neo shit. You can get into these things and shift them. And I think if A, they made the correlation of their ancestry as a thing of power versus a thing of shame. And B, they've learned these things that they're empowered to actually know that you have agency in your life and you can hack your reality, if you will. And then the third people, you teach them coding. Then you're giving them an opportunity to enter a sector that has a lot of upside, but you're giving them a moral compass and a competitive advantage relative to their peers. And that they can enter the table not just like, oh, I want to create the new Floppy Bird, or like, versus like, hey, this is a deep ancestry and technology, the science and technologies of integrated. I tell people, don't say Hawaiian culture, say ancestral sciences and technologies of integrated biosystems management. And then you enter in that space, like, then you can step into these spaces as a learner, co-learner, not just as, oh, please teach me, great wise ones, because I'm this impoverished brown kid. It's like, I have so much to offer you guys. I know my relative value. I know my value relative to you.
Right.
And let's have a negotiation,
Right.
which I think Purple Maya has been really awesome at doing. And that's kind of why I've enjoyed being there.
Right.
And I think, yeah.
Great. Wondering, sort of like, what is your, like, kind of, what do you think is your kind of main goal over the next 5 years?
In my lifetime, my wanana or my prophecy that I want to see out is that we're setting up the infrastructure that people in our community and people of other communities like ours will be contracted to help solve for global problems. And that, especially around climate adaptation and societal reconciliation. And I think they're one and the same. In Hawaiian, there's no word for environment. The environment is just the externalization of our attitudes. You can talk about adaptive technologies, but if you don't figure out adaptive psychologies first, you're shit out of luck, right? Like, it's us.
Yeah.
Is this environment is a reflection of our attitudes and our consumption, right? And to do that, I think locally, I really been called, like I've had 10 years on the ground in trying to implement the stuff that I talk. It's been very humbling, but it's also been extremely rewarding, and it's you learn a lot from having to back up what you say with people you really care about in a community that you love but want to strangle sometimes. And I think that I see the path to getting there in 5 years is I think we have a working thesis on the ground. And I think where it's important for us to be able to negotiate with now is leverage what's working on the ground to shift policy and philanthropy. I think I feel a real calling to do that. And if we can, in Hawaii is a real unique kind of social, political climate where you have these things called ali'i trusts, where you have the chief's will and all of their land holdings are put into these trusts that have now become huge power brokers in Hawaii with billions of dollars and land assets and policy arms. And I think they're really beautiful things because they said, despite people may have beefs with them, I see like they're a tool that's there and it matters who's populating them, right? Intrinsically, they're there to serve.
Yeah. I mean, when I had a long conversation with a couple of our partners at Kamehameha Schools where they sort of kind of told me about the different trusts, because I only knew about the bishop estate, I didn't know about the other one. And that's one of the things that we were talking about afterwards is that it's a tool that no other indigenous community has.
And I think that to be the hope that I have is to call them ali'i trusts. And in Hawaiian society, And I'm just like 15 years out of Hawaiian studies, so people probably can pick this apart with all the new learning, but have at, then go in the community and do something with it instead of just like critiquing people on Facebook. But you have your Ali'i Trust, your Ali'i, and then you had the people on the ground, which is the Maka'ainana, that did the work. And you had this intermediary level, which was the Konohiki, that were the brokers between the Ali'i and the Maka'ainana. And I think the emerging, people talk about Ali'i Trust as this conglomeration of different Ali'i organizations that have all of these resources and money. The challenge, I think, the Ali'i Trust is that they talk about it in English, and therefore the people are the beneficiaries. But in pre-contact times, the Maka'ainana were not beneficiaries. They were experts. And the role of the chiefs was to convene the power and distribute it to the experts to take that convened power and turn it into productivity. And the intermediary was the Konohiki was the intermediary. They were the brokers. And now that is actually playing itself out in program structures. You're having more and more enlightened members working in Ali'i Trust. You have social enterprises that are coming up. And you also have some really awesome networked organizations. Like my wife's organization works at Kua Aina Uluawamo, Hackbed, where these organizations of people that go and they help networks mobilize, who are actually acting like Konohiki, and they're doing the brokering. I think what I want to see in the next 5 years is that as we have Ali'i Trusts, we're now able to articulate Maka'ainana Trusts. That we are our earning power, our infiltration of the education system. What starts off as infiltration of the education system moves into the normalization of it, where ancestral thinking is shown to be completely relevant and valid to the state of Hawaii, not just us as Hawaiians.
Right.
And I think that co-learning is happening, and I think those two things come together to really magnify the thinking of Pacific Islanders, not as an act of justice, but as an act of practical survival for the species. Because I think what the world is coming to realize is what our ancestors knew. This is an island. And this is a hot, like, we live on hot islands. We're forecasting what the world needs to understand. So in 5 years, I really want to see, because as a father of 2 children, a 9-year-old, 8-year-old, and a 5-year-old, if we're not doing this intervention now, we might as well jump in on the next spaceship with Elon, right? You know, it's like, because like, and I refuse to subscribe. I think I love about our ancestry is that we don't have an apocalypse.
Is that we
don't have an apocalypse. There's no end game in our story. There's no great ending of it all. It's continual adaptation. And I believe that, having met our Maori cousins when I went down to New Zealand, the first thing I thought was, this place is cold. And the second thing I thought was like, they're just like us. The shift in this weather did not change them from being recognizable to me as a Hawaiian. So I know that we can adapt to things. And one in 5 years that, you know, we're really intentional about setting these structures up, and that we're really intentional about setting them up to be able to be bequeathed and not just hold on to forever, and like building in our succession plan. And I think why this for me, I'm sitting here, is I really want the thinking that's happening in Hawaii and Pacific Islanders to have more of a national or international, if you take, foothold. And I think we have a hard time having conversations outside of Hawaii because the Hawaii Visitors Bureau controls the narrative of what Hawaii is. But I think the more, the more solidarity we are with brothers and sisters on the continent, or all Indigenous people, you know, as a starting point, can help us reach out beyond Indigenous communities, so we can have this to everybody. This just becomes a practical conversation. But on the other hand, our Indigenous people own the IP. We're not fucking around. We know what we're doing. we know our relative value. You won't get away with giving us metal. We went to your business schools, figured your stuff out. And you know, we want to be able to help people, but we don't want to be supplanted in the process. You know, I think that's the emerging conversation. Was that answer?
No, that's great. That's great. The last question, which I think I emailed to you, I'm not sure, but...
Sorry, I haven't got into it.
I usually ask this at the end. And actually, Prem, can we?
I never asked the interviews. I always get asked to interview. I was like, it's just kind of like, I don't want, like, my dad would always be like, you know, he's such a great speaker, but his big thing to me, like, you know, y'all mouth sometimes if you just talk, right? And that's like, it's like 90% work, 10% talk, right? And I don't believe that there's such thing as a professional thought leader. It's a doing comes out of it. But I get asked for whatever reason. I'm really lucky that I actually have an opportunity to share these things. Because everything I feel, if there's value, if people feel value and they ask me to talk, I'm like super clear, like, this is because I was invested in, and people have taken the time to talk to me. And also, like, I tend to be working in a lot of organizations that are, especially like Mao, that are doing something really unique. So people always want to understand it. So, you know, I have a lot of opportunities to speak, and I found that people wouldn't ask me certain questions. So I just full disclose, like, out the gate, like, oh yeah, I grew up listening to punk. All these weird things, just to make really clear that, like, there is a lot to my thinking and to what I pull from, and all of it is from Indigenous practices. There's from all these other things too that are really important. So I've always, I guess it's a long way of saying, I always, like, no one ever asked me to talk about what I do from the perspective of science fiction or all these other things. So I don't know, I found that I always kind of inserted what the questions I wanted people to ask me to whatever the hell it was they were talking. I just
you find a way to get in there.
Just to keep myself interested. Sometimes it's all these conversations. I would just have this thing to it. It's like, but, you know, I guess, I don't know, like,
the answer could be there isn't anything.
I guess the answer I have, like, that is such a good question that I really need to think about, like, you know, what. And I think that question is more than a good, it's a gift, I think. I think a lot of the people like Noi and myself who, you know, we were mentored by people that were great speakers and great voices for our community, and then we were kind of pushed into that role. But we carry a lot of weight, because I know, like, Noi and myself, I know who I'm accountable to.
You know
who I'm accountable to.
Right.
And I gotta go back home every day and work with them, right?
Yeah.
And I also know the struggles of those that came before me and what they've invested in me so I could have a voice, right? So the moment I fall in love with my own voice, or having this ability to talk, fuck me, right? It's really, what's the utility of me sharing, and is it of value? And is it honestly reflecting the people that invested in me, and is it honestly creating a platform for the people that, for whatever grace of God, I can be speaking for and they can't. I'm really mindful, and it often puts us in a heavy headspace, like. And I guess that why I like that question is, like, despite all that, we're actually really people too that are weird and quirky. We never get a chance to ask that, and I feel I operate the best when I could just put aside the job titles and just be people with people.
Well, part of the my motivation for doing these interviews is also that interest in finding and, like, the people side, like,
right.
You guys are all people. You all got big brains. You're doing great work. You know, and they're all people too.
With burnt out frontal lobes. But I think if there was a question that no one's ever asked me is, I don't know, like, probably would probably go into some dark place. Like, you know, or like, what I think that one of the things I've learned to embrace is to ask dangerous questions lovingly, but then hold yourself accountable that you're the person that asked it, and join in the answer, and, like, you know, and not just put people on the spot. Sure, risking a dangerous question. I think the question, quite frankly, I would ask myself is, how much of the things you talk about do you still really believe in? And I think that's a dangerous question.
It's sort of related to kind of like a sense of momentum, right? There's sort of momentum built up over years.
It's laws of entropy. Nature abhors stasis. And we can fall in love with our ideas, but if we're not, if we're not open to critiquing them as hard as we critique each other, and know that it's not if, it's when these ideas begin to no longer answer what's actually happening on the ground now. The danger I feel for folks that do get often asked a lot of questions is to believe that they have a lot of answers. And when you lose the ability to ask questions of yourself all times and question the things you love, you run the risk of becoming a prisoner of what you're good at. And I've seen that burn people out. There's a wonderful quote from the Buddha. Is like, I'm paraphrasing and probably saying it wrong, but I am the finger pointing to the moon. I'm not the moon. Let go of the finger. And I think asking questions like to ask people how much of that if you've been saying that for a long time, and you go in, there are certain things I say I just like and asking myself, do you really believe that anymore? Real?
Sounds good, but yeah.
And I think that humbling yourself to knowing that maybe it may have made sense at one time, but things change, and now you really got to think about that. Because you should never be in service of your narrative, you should be in service of service, right? And that's like being in a relationship. So, I mean, if I was to ask myself that question, I would say that's a really good question.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of things that I still do, but I can see, because I get to work with youth on a daily basis, every single year the same age, I think I'm lucky enough to see the layers of strata beginning to pile up and like these shifts happening.
Yeah.
And I guess the eternal question is, what's the enduring and what's the flex?
Right.
What is perpetually relevant?
Well, I think it's related to what you've talked about, touched on here and there, which is like, what is the success metric?
Right.
Right. Like
what endures, right?
What is it that you're really looking at moving and changing?
And that's the beauty of life, I think, is that it's imperfect.
Mm-hmm.
And we try to create grandeur in our narratives and all these things. But really, like, a lot of us is just fucked up as everybody else, you know what I mean? To be perfectly frank, you ask my wife. God, it's like, I see her roll her eyes and they get to talk. But I think as Native people, we're not given the ability to be fucked up.
Right.
We have to be the noble savage. Because we gotta save everybody else from this shit,
exactly.
right?